Hello, my name is Jack, and if you're anything like me, you probably have a whole load of ideas and projects in your head that you've been wanting to start for months or maybe even years, but you're waiting for the quote-unquote perfect time. I'm sure you've heard this before, but there is no such thing. Do not wait for the perfect time. It does not exist. The best time to start was yesterday, but the second best time is today. Again, if you're anything like me, you probably worry that when you start something, you're going to be awful at it and you're going to suck. You need to understand that this is a feature and not a bug. In fact, my advice to you would be suck hard and suck fast. This is advice that can be applied over a few areas of life, but you get what I'm saying. The more time you spend practicing and more than likely failing, the more you'll learn and the faster you'll learn. You know, it's important that you stick it out through that awkward beginner phase because you have to push through that part if you really want to become good at something. And to illustrate this point, I've got a bit of a story for you that relates to the gameplay that's going on in the background. So a few years ago, I made my own mod from scratch for Fallout 4, and you'll actually see parts of the mod being showcased in the footage. What the mod does is adds a whole list of new legendary effects which are meant to feel right at home in the vanilla game. It's worth mentioning that before I made this mod, I had no experience modding in Fallout 4 or any other game, so when I started, I was a complete noob. So a few years ago, I was playing through Fallout 4, as you do, and I remember at the time I was working in a bar, and I did one shift on a particular Sunday, and Sunday shifts were very, very quiet. You would only see a few people over the course of the day, and I was doing the close, so it was even quieter because it was in the evening. And so I had a lot of time to myself with not a lot to do, and so eventually I got thinking, if I could add new legendary effects to Fallout 4, what would they be? And so over the next couple of weeks, I came up with this list of effects that I liked the sound of and I thought would fit in the game. I think I came up with 18 in the end. And then after a while, I thought, well, what's actually stopping me from putting these in the game? You know, the developers actually provide you with something they call the creation kit, which is essentially a modding resource that gives you access to every element of the game. And I thought if I could learn how that works, I could actually get these effects working in-game. And so I loaded up the creation kit and started just messing around. And I pretty much had no idea what I was doing. I think the only time I'd used the creation kit in the past was for very minor things like editing the stats on a weapon attachment or correcting the spelling in someone else's mod. But you know, I just kept at it. I kept trying and I kept learning. I was looking at other parts of the game that were similar to what I wanted to make and sort of reverse engineered them. And through a lot of trial and error, I eventually got a lot of my effects working. In fact, the effect that you're seeing on screen right now is actually one of my favorites. It causes enemies to explode shortly after dying. Very fun, but also very dangerous. Honestly, I can't tell you how satisfying it was working on some of the more complex effects for weeks at a time, feeling like I'm just beating my head against the wall, getting absolutely nowhere, and then finally getting them to work in game was really a great feeling. I believe the mod took me a grand total of 10 weeks to make. And don't get me wrong, a lot of that time was just spent figuring out what the hell I was doing. I think I could probably make it in half the time if I made it today. But I really think it was necessary to spend that amount of time on it so I could really get a good understanding of just how the software works. I remember before I started, I told myself that I didn't want to write any scripts for my mod. Scripts are essentially blocks of code that you write outside of the creation kit. And they allow you to do much more complicated things that you can't do with the creation kit, but the thing is, you have to know what you're doing. You have to know how to write them because they're not easy to understand. And I had absolutely no knowledge of this stuff beforehand, so I wanted to avoid writing them if I could. But after a while, it became apparent that certain effects that I really wanted to include just weren't going to be possible without writing scripts. So I decided to bite the bullet and start writing some scripts. And after reverse engineering some existing ones and many, many hours spent on the wiki, I finally got some of my own working. And you know, some are pretty simple, but some are actually kind of complex. And I think in the final mod, roughly a third of the effects are built off of scripts, which is pretty good if you ask me, considering I had no idea how to write them when I first started. But the point of the video is just start. Just start doing the things that you've been wanting to do. Accept that you're probably going to be bad at them when you first start, but don't let it stop you. I know it can be daunting and intimidating taking on something new, especially when there's a lot of information and knowledge that you feel like you have to take on board. But, you know, don't just sit there and think about it. Time that you spend sitting there thinking about how you're going to do it could be time that you're spending learning how to actually do it. There's been so many different things that I've wanted to do over the last couple of years, but I always seem to find a way of talking myself out of them. The thing is, if you think about something for long enough, you will eventually come up with potential negative outcomes, and then that's what you fixate on. That is what you'll convince yourself will happen if you do it. So my advice would be think less, do more. You know, obviously think about it a little bit. Don't think about it so little that you become reckless, but don't think about it so much to the point that you never actually end up doing it. You know, something that I've learned in the last few years is that generally speaking, the things that we want most in life are usually on the other side of some sort of negative emotion. Emotions like anxiety, embarrassment, fear. Quite often what we want is on the other side of some sort of discomfort. And think about when you most often feel these sorts of emotions. It's usually when you've just started something new or are about to start something new. And that's almost always the hardest part of doing anything, is that first initial stage. So if you can push through that and keep at it, it gets easier from there. So that's my message for today. Hope you found it helpful. Hope you enjoyed. If you are still playing this now 10-year-old game and you're interested in the mod, I will leave a link in the description. I've just updated it with some new effects and balance changes, bug fixes, all that good stuff. Seemed like a good time to drop an update, what with Season 2 of the Fallout show coming out, which I still need to watch actually. I've heard pretty good things, good reviews. But what do you guys think of it? Are you enjoying it? I watched the first episode of the first season, and I just haven't got around to watching the rest of it, but it's still on my list, so I do want to watch that eventually. But other than that, I think that will do it for today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.